Before we dive into today's stories, if you love the strange, dark, and mysterious told in story format, you've come to the right place. That's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that sounds good to you, make sure to subscribe and turn on all notifications. Oh, and while you're at it, invite the like button to go skydiving, but replace their parachute with an anvil. All right, let's get into it. One afternoon in the spring of 1990, a young mother was tidying up her living room in Pingyang Township, a small rural community in southern China. As she smoothed out the last cushion, a sound stopped her cold. Her 3-year-old twin daughters were crying. Now, kids cry all the time. It's nothing unusual. But these two, they never cried. Ever. Their names were Shai and Xiong Wu, and from the moment they were born, they were eerily silent. As babies, they hardly made a sound. No giggles, no babbling, just quiet. At first, their mother thought she had hit the parenting jackpot. 2 easy, low-maintenance kids. But as they grew, their silence became unsettling. Even at 3 years old, they had never spoken a single word. And they weren't just quiet. They barely moved. All they wanted to do was sleep. So when their mother heard them sobbing, real hysterical crying, she ran down the hall, her heart pounding. She burst into their nursery and found them sitting up in their crib, tears streaming down their faces. They were completely inconsolable. Panicked, she scooped them up, checking them over. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" But of course they didn't answer. They just kept crying. She searched for bruises, scratches, anything that could explain this sudden outburst. But there was nothing. No fever, no injuries, just 2 terrified little girls with no way to say what was wrong. Eventually, they calmed down. She tucked them back into bed, and within minutes, they drifted off to sleep like nothing had happened. A few days later, life went back to normal, or at least what passed as normal for them. The twins stayed quiet, sleeping most of the day. Their mother, still shaken by the strange episode, tried to push it from her mind as she went about her usual chores. That afternoon, as she passed by their nursery, she paused. The door was closed. The girls were inside, sleeping soundly, and yet something felt off. She lingered for a second, pressing her hand against the wood. On the other side of that door, her daughters lay in their crib, silent as always. The mother hadn't heard a peep from her daughters all day. It was nothing unusual. Shay and Xiong Wu were always quiet. But as she walked down the hallway, something made her stop cold right outside their nursery door. From inside the room, she heard a sound she had never heard before. Her daughters were talking. At first, she felt a rush of excitement. This was huge. Their first words. She wanted to burst in and scoop them up, to finally hear her little girl speak after 3 long years of silence. But something held her back. She worried that if she went in, she might scare them into silence. So instead, she pressed her ear to the door and listened. What she heard made her blood run cold. They weren't just babbling random words like toddlers do. They were having a full-blown conversation. Their voices were clear, precise, adult-like. Words flowed effortlessly between them as if they had been speaking their entire lives. It made no sense. The longer she listened, the more disturbed she became, not just because her daughters, who had never spoken before, were now talking like grown adults, but because of what they were talking about. The girls were discussing specific people and events from a completely different village, one they had never been to, never even heard of. And yet They spoke with intimate detail, as if they had lived there. In most places, this would be enough for a mother to call a doctor immediately. But this wasn't just anywhere. This was Pingyang Township. And in this small rural town, people knew better, because Pingyang held a dark and eerie secret. Out of its 7,000 residents, over 100 people claimed to be the reincarnated spirits of those who had died tragic, violent deaths. And as the mother stood frozen outside that nursery door, a terrible realization settled over her. Her daughters weren't just talking, they were remembering. This wasn't just some wild belief held by a handful of people. In Pingyang Township, everyone, all 7,000 residents, firmly believed that some among them were reincarnated souls of those who had died tragic, untimely deaths. And this belief wasn't just talk, it shaped every part of life. People who claimed to be reincarnated would approach strangers and say things like, "In my past life, your family owed me a debt. Now you need to pay it." And without hesitation, the non-reincarnated people would pay. Other times, the stakes were higher. Fist fights had broken out when a reincarnated person confronted someone and said, "In my past life, you insulted me, or worse, you killed me, and now we settle it." And in Pingyang, that was normal. But not all of these interactions were about conflict. The town had adjusted to the presence of reincarnated souls in ways that might seem unbelievable to outsiders. Take, for example, the butcher. One day, a young boy came forward claiming to be the reincarnated spirit of a pig that had been slaughtered in town. And when he identified the very butcher who had killed him, the butcher immediately shut down his business. He did not argue. He did not protest. He simply said, "I don't want to offend anyone," and found another way to make a living. So when this mother heard her silent, speechless twin daughters suddenly speaking in adult-level detail about people and places they had never known, she didn't panic. She understood. There was only one explanation. Her daughters were not just talking, they were reincarnated spirits. Therefore, instead of calling a doctor, she did what anyone in Pingyang would do. She spread the word, not just in her village, but all across Pingyang Township, telling everyone that her daughters had lived before, and if their past life families were still out there, they might want to come and meet the loved ones who now lived inside her daughters. Less than a week after the mother spread the word, there was a knock at the door. A man and a woman, complete strangers, stood outside. When the mother let them in, her twin girls didn't hesitate. They recognized them instantly. One of the twins pointed and said, "That's my mother and father from my past life." And then these 3-year-old girls who had never spoken a word before that week began telling a story that left everyone in the room speechless. They explained that in their previous life, they weren't actually sisters. They were best friends. And together, they had made a terrible choice. They had taken their own lives. Just 1 month later, they were reborn into the bodies of these twin girls. The story didn't stop there. They spoke of a village they had never been to, describing it in perfect detail. They spoke of their former lives, recalling intimate moments only those girls would have known. And when they described the events surrounding their deaths, even the smallest details, including where their bodies were found, were 100% accurate. The twins' mother, still trying to process what she was hearing, turned to the couple. "Is what they're saying true?" she asked. Without hesitation, the man and woman nodded. "Yes, every word." Then As if that revelation wasn't chilling enough, the twins turned to their mother and explained why they had never spoken before. We were keeping our reincarnation a secret, and the reason they slept so much? Because when we sleep, we dream about our past lives, and we miss them. To this day, no one has been able to offer a better explanation for how these toddlers could have such precise knowledge of places they had never been and people they had never met. The only explanation that makes sense? They really were the reincarnated spirits of those two teenage girls. In addition, Pingyang Township remains one of the world's most unsettling hotspots for alleged reincarnation. This next story is going to sound completely insane once it gets going, but stick with it, because by the end, there's a twist that will blow your mind. On a warm spring afternoon in 1883, a young woman named Sarah was tidying up her small farmhouse in the remote Arizona settlement of Eagle Creek. As she swept the floor, her sister Elizabeth stepped outside with a bucket to fetch water from the spring. Sarah and Elizabeth lived together with their families, 4 kids between them, while their husbands herded sheep and worked the land. Out here in the wild, lawless West, it wasn't safe to live alone. Families banded together to survive. For Sarah, it was just another quiet afternoon, until the dogs started barking. At first, she ignored it, but their barking turned wild, aggressive, frantic, nothing like their usual lazy, half-hearted barks. Something was out there. Sarah immediately froze. Then, keeping her voice steady, she told the kids, "Stay inside." She stepped out onto the porch. Her eyes scanned the landscape, rocky scrub to the left, open land to the right, nothing out of place. But the dogs weren't barking at the fields. They were fixed on something just beyond the sandy hill in front of the house. Sarah followed their gaze. At first, she saw nothing, but then something moved. A huge creature lumbered over the crest of the hill. Its red fur bristled, its twisted back contorted unnaturally. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, because riding this nightmare of an animal was a man, except he wasn't human. His face was hollowed out, sunken like a corpse. His mouth stretched into an impossible grin, and his eyes, he had no eyes. Sarah's blood ran cold. A deeply religious woman, there was only one possible explanation. The devil. He had come for her family, her children. Sarah didn't hesitate. She spun on her heels, bolted inside, and slammed the door shut. Then she barricaded it with the kitchen table. The kids huddled around her, terrified, as she wrapped her arms around them and began praying. Outside, the dogs screeched in terror, and then a blood-curdling scream tore through the air, a human scream. Sarah's heart stopped, because whatever was out there wasn't just after her, and then it hit her. Elizabeth. She was still out there. That scream, the one that had torn through the night like a knife, it had to be her. But Sarah couldn't move. She was frozen in terror, clutching the kids even tighter. She wanted to run outside to find her sister, to help her. But she couldn't. Not with the kids here. Not with the devil himself lurking just beyond the door. So she did the only thing she could do. She prayed. Hours passed. The house was silent except for Sarah's whispered prayers and the soft breathing of the children, now half asleep in her arms. And Elizabeth? She never came back. She never made another sound. Sarah's stomach twisted with guilt, but just when she thought she couldn't take another second of this agonizing silence, there were footsteps on the porch. Then the doorknob rattled. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was him, The devil was back. The kids screamed. Sarah screamed. But then a voice. No, two voices. Sarah knew those voices. Her husband, Elizabeth's husband. They were back from herding the sheep. Sarah collapsed with relief, yanking away the barricade and throwing open the door. Tears streamed down her face as she sobbed out the story. The devil, the creature, the scream. And then finally, the worst part. Elizabeth was still missing. The husbands didn't know what to think, but Elizabeth was gone, and that was all that mattered. They grabbed their guns and lanterns and took off toward the spring. At first, they walked, trying to keep their nerves in check. But the more they called her name, the deeper the silence became. So they ran, and then they saw her, lying in the dirt near the water, face down, blood everywhere. Elizabeth was dead. Her husband fell to his knees, wailing, while Sarah's husband jumped on his horse and raced into town to find the coroner. When the coroner arrived, he examined the scene carefully. One thing was clear: Elizabeth had been trampled to death. But by what? Because surrounding her body, imprinted deep into the dirt, were hoofprints, massive hoofprints, way too big to belong to a horse. The coroner furrowed his brow. "This wasn't a horse," he muttered. Sarah, still shaken, told him everything about the creature, the man with no eyes, the unholy grin, the devil on his red beast. The coroner listened carefully, and when she was done, he nodded. Yes, she was definitely trampled to death by something, he agreed. But then he shook his head. I just don't know what. And because he couldn't explain it, because nothing made sense, he officially listed Elizabeth's cause of death as unknown. But the Warners' skepticism didn't stop the story from spreading like wildfire. Before long, everyone on the Arizona frontier had heard whispers of the devil and the strange beast he rode. People even gave them a name, the Red Ghost. At first, most folks brushed it off. Just another tall tale, a campfire story to spook travelers. But then, the sightings started piling up, and they just kept getting weirder. Campers swore they'd seen the Red Ghost galloping through the Arizona wilderness. Some even claimed that in the dead of night it had stormed through their camps, trampling their tents to shreds. One cowboy got close enough to throw a lasso around the creature's neck. But when he did, the Red Ghost took off so fast, so violently, that the cowboy was dragged through the dirt before he had to let go. For years, stories like this kept rolling in until, nearly a decade after Elizabeth's death, a farmer in eastern Arizona glanced out his window and saw something standing in his turnip patch. It was huge, red, and covered in scars and strange markings. It was him, the Red Ghost. The farmer had heard all the stories, and he already knew exactly what he would do if he ever saw the creature for himself. He'd shoot it, so he grabbed his rifle, took aim, and fired. The Red Ghost collapsed in the dirt. The farmer's heart was pounding as he sprinted outside, running straight to the body. For years, people had feared this thing. For years, rumors had twisted into legend. And now, here it was, lying dead in the middle of his field. But when the farmer finally got a good look at the creature, his blood ran cold, because all the stories were wrong. The Red Ghost wasn't the devil. It wasn't a monster. And the first of those beings, well, it was a creature that today you'd immediately recognize. But back in the 1800s on the Arizona frontier, people had no idea what they were looking at. They had never seen anything like it before. It had red fur, a long neck, and a humped back. It was a camel. Turns out, Camels had been imported from the Mediterranean to help haul supplies across the western frontier. But this one, it had escaped captivity, and for years it had wandered the Arizona wilderness, striking terror into anyone who saw it. But the camel itself wasn't what terrified people. The real horror, the thing that created the legend of the red ghost, was the rider. When Sarah first saw it, she thought it was a man. But when she looked closer, she realized it wasn't human. It had no eyes. Its mouth was stretched into a ghastly, toothy grin. It looked like something straight out of hell. So Sarah assumed the only logical thing, it had to be the devil himself. But she was wrong, because it was a man. Or at least, it used to be. The devil on the camel's back was actually a decomposing corpse. At some point, maybe months, maybe years before, this man had been alive, riding this very camel, and then something happened. He died. But instead of falling off, his body remained slumped upright, lashed to the saddle. And that terrifying grin Sarah saw, that was just his face, rotted away. His flesh had shrunk, his lips had peeled back, leaving a permanent grinning skull in its place. For years, this camel had wandered the desert, dragging its dead rider along with it, giving people the haunting and unforgettable image of a grinning corpse riding a red beast through the night. The red ghost. Today, the legend of the red ghost lives on in Arizona. In fact, there's even a permanent statue of the infamous phantom camel standing in a small town called Quartzsite.